Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? There's a particular retro Mac model that I've been after for a while. But now that I have one, can I get it working? Shipping retro computers these days is incredibly risky. Components and plastics become fragile with age, and horror stories about machines arriving completely destroyed are common. It's best to find something you want locally and pick it up yourself, but when that thing you want was only sold halfway around the world, sometimes you have no choice but to take the chance. I found a very uncommon Mac model I'd been wanting for decades for an incredible price. The catch being, it would be coming from Japan. While I've had mostly good luck with items I've ordered arriving intact, this would be a real test. To stack the odds in my favor, I paid extra to the proxy shipping company to repack the machine before sending it on to the US, and it certainly looks like I got my money's worth. Not only did they use expanding foam packs, but they also wrapped the computer in bubble wrap and even put a piece of cardboard over the screen to protect it. If you've watched my channel for a while, you may know I'm very fond of the Mac Color Classic from 1993, so you might be confused as to why I seemingly bought another one. While this machine does share its form factor, there's a major difference, and it's one that fixes many of the complaints about the Color Classic when it was new. This is a Mac Performa 275, which was also sold as the Color Classic 2, but in even fewer numbers. It has the same 10-inch color Trinitron CRT and distinctive styling, but its motherboard is much improved over the original, and that board would no doubt need some repairs after 30 years. These computers had a clever slide-out motherboard design that made upgrades easy, but I also noticed that the hard drive was missing. That's something I'll have to take care of later. First though, I was relieved to find that while the original PRAM or clock battery was still left in the board, it hadn't yet leaked. These have the tendency to fail suddenly by spraying their electrolyte everywhere, which is highly corrosive and will destroy components and the PCB itself. Between arriving without any shipping damage and now this, I felt like I was truly pushing my luck. The board would definitely need to have its surface mount capacitors replaced, which can also wreak havoc in much the same way. I started the repair by soaking the board in a tub filled with distilled water. I've found that removing any capacitor electrolyte first can help the recapping process later, and also make apparent any damage that may have occurred. A gentle scrub with a soft toothbrush is usually all that's necessary, then I left the board to sit overnight to dry. It's common for cap leakage to damage traces or the legs of adjacent components, and on this board, the sound chip is often a victim. But I didn't see anything concerning. The caps had started to leak, but it looks like I caught them just in time. I use hot air to remove old SMD caps, so to protect plastic parts, I'll either wrap them in Kapton tape or cut a piece of aluminum foil to use as a heat shield. Then I could prop the board up and apply flux to all the solder joints. From there, it's just a matter of methodically and gently heating up each cap, then lifting it away with tweezers. With care and some luck, you should be able to avoid damaging any solder pads, though I did have a couple of caps pop as I was removing them. My good luck continued as all of the caps came off without trouble and there wasn't any new damage to the motherboard. I cleaned up the pads with some desoldering braid, then soaked the board again, this time in isopropyl alcohol. This not only removes any remaining flux, but also helps drive out any moisture that had gotten trapped underneath the chips. I gave it another gentle scrubbing, then let it sit for an hour or so. The IPA can be reused a few times, so I funneled it back into its container and set the board out to dry. Then came the part I was most apprehensive about. With the board clean, any electrolyte damage would be much more apparent. But I couldn't really find any. Usually there's at least a little corrosion or some bubbled solder mask, but not this time. The only thing wrong was self-inflicted, a small spot on the rear edge connector that had gotten ever so slightly deformed from the heat. Looks like I didn't do quite a good enough job with the foil, but I'll take it. Tantalum capacitors are a popular choice as replacements since they won't leak, but I tend to use electrolytics as they leave the board looking original. I'll apply solder to just one of the pads, then heat it up and slide the cap into place. This ensures that it ends up flush with the PCB, and then I can simply tack down the other side. There aren't many caps on this motherboard, and none are in overly tricky places to reach, so this repair was nowhere near as arduous as some others I've undertaken. But there are other caps in this computer too, and they at least needed to be inspected before I tried to power it on. The rear housing is held on with just 4 screws, and removing it exposes the CRT and analog board. This single-sided PCB handles not just the power supply for the machine, but also the high-voltage circuitry for the display. It has several dozen through-hole capacitors of various sizes, and some are more prone to fail than others. But Apple used good quality parts here, and none of them are showing any obvious problems. No doubt this board will need to be recapped at some point, and I have another Color Classic I already know will need the same treatment, so I'll tackle both at a later date. There was one thing I noticed wrong on the analog board though. This connector from the CRT's neck board was loose. I suspected it connected to the metal shield as a ground, but I decided to pop the back off of my other Color Classic in order to confirm. And sure enough, that's where it belongs, so I got it plugged back in. I'm not sure if it shook loose during shipping or if someone had worked on the machine previously. The one thing I knew someone had done was remove the hard drive. It slides into the frame on a plastic sled, which was also missing. These machines used SCSI drives, and I happen to have a suitable spare on hand, a 250 megabyte unit from Quantum. But I'd still need a bracket, and I didn't really want to go with a mechanical drive anyway. So, as is often the case with retro repairs now, 3D printing came to the rescue. I printed a bracket I had modified to work with a blue SCSI module. There are a few variations on these, and I found that the two I had on hand held a key difference. Literally, the SCSI connector key is rotated 180 degrees. But due to the short cable inside the Mac, this meant only one would be suitable. The drive bay is a bit cramped, but the bracket clicked into place, and I was just able to plug in the ribbon cable. Time to test. These machines need a working PRAM battery to boot properly, so I dropped in a fresh one, then got the computer put back together. It had been downright painless so far, so I wondered if my luck was about to run out. I plugged in my external blue SCSI to give it something to boot from, hooked up the AC cable, and hit the power button. Yep, it booted on the first try. The sound clearly worked and the display was clear and bright. The internal blue SCSI was detected and able to be formatted, then I got an OS installed, going with System 753. So, what's the deal with this computer? Why did it take me so long to get one? The reason is simple scarcity, not just now, but even when it was new. The original Color Classic was sold worldwide, but wasn't a very popular machine. At its launch in early 1993, people were gravitating towards computers with larger screens and multimedia features like CD-ROM drives, both of which it lacked. But what also hurt sales was poor performance. Apple had hobbled the Color Classic with a 16 MHz Motorola 68030 CPU, but also put it on a 16-bit data bus, which made it feel even slower. 4 megabytes of RAM came soldered to the motherboard, but even though the machine had a pair of SIM slots, it only supported a maximum of 10 megs. Later in 1993, Apple tried to fix the situation by releasing the Color Classic 2, which had a different motherboard. the same one, in fact, as the larger LC550. It doubled CPU speed to 33 MHz and used a 32-bit bus, which not only improved performance considerably, but also bumped the maximum RAM up to 36 MB. And that RAM upgrade is one I decided to perform. The Color Classic 2 and Performa 275 shipped with 8 megs total, but I had a 32 meg module I decided to swap in just for fun. This machine is really what the original Color Classic should have been, which makes it even more perplexing that Apple never sold it in the US. The Performa 275 was identical to the Color Classic 2, but aimed more at the consumer market, and crucially, apparently only available in South Korea and Japan. Not many were sold to begin with, so that makes surviving ones all that less common these days. Thus, when I saw this one pop up on Yahoo Auctions Japan, it got my attention. Thing is, it wasn't the only one. Apparently, the seller had come across a small quantity of Color Classic models, original ones, Color Classic 2s, and this Performa 275, and had priced them incredibly low. Despite 15 bids on the auction, I somehow managed to win mine for only $80 US. On the rare occasion that Color Classic 2 models show up on eBay, they sell for $1,000 or more, so it didn't sting too badly that I paid almost 3 times as much for shipping as I did for the computer itself. And as you might imagine, I'm very happy with how things turned out. It's almost as if this machine wanted to find a new home, with how relatively frictionless it all ended up being. Other than recapping the analog board as preventative maintenance, the only other thing on my list is dealing with the yellowed plastics. Normally this is something I look past, but there's an obvious spot on the front where a sticker had been that's a few shades different. I'll save that work for the summer when I have another Color Classic case to retrobrite as well. The story of the Color Classic series is an interesting one we've tackled previously. Unloved at launch, but ultimately embraced by a small group of dedicated owners who pushed the machines beyond their limits. The Color Classic 2 and Performa 275 tried, but ultimately failed, to right their predecessors' wrongs. Yet, considering the legacy they left behind, perhaps this was for the best after all. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on social media @thisdoesnotcomp, and as always, thanks for watching.